Hi, I'm Katie, and this is the Free Art and Design School podcast, web series, whatever. I have one of my favorite people here today. If you'd like to introduce yourself,
Yeah, hi, I'm Hannah Saidiner, and I'm an designer, animator, creative, I guess.
you're in everything.
Yeah, I guess that's where I'm at. I don't know.
I had the joy and sadness to meet you in the horrible world that is Zoom school at CalArts. And you were finishing up your degree, and I was just starting mine. And I've always been completely blown away by your work and your energy and just your incredible devotion to everything you're making. I thought you could start off by talking a little bit about how you became an animator and motion graphic designer.
Yeah. Um, so I grew up in LA, still am here, took a little break and went to Chicago for 6 months, but basically been here my whole life. And my parents were always really into animated stuff when they had me. My first movie was Fantasia 2000. Like I think they were like, we're really gonna get her into it. And they weren't planning to be like, she's gonna do this, but I think they did see that I liked art at a pretty early age, and so they made the connection when I wouldn't really watch live action things that they were like, seems like she likes this stuff. And I think just exposure over time and figuring out the kind of artwork that I wanted to make, and also, I mean, exposure through what I watched, but also just exposure and location and like being nearby made it so I decided like in middle school that that was what I wanted to do. And I kind of just did everything I could to get there. I did
Mm.
the research that's made it seem like, CalArts was the place to be if you were going to do it. And so I think I put a lot of effort into like making work that I mean, felt true to myself, but also that I hoped would eventually get me there. Um, that also was helped by doing classes that were taught by CalArts alums who were truly some of the most influential people to me. They introduced me to what my major was, which is experimental animation, because I came in thinking like it just like only character animation existed. And I maybe had some understanding, but I think just being under the like tutelage of people who were making that kind of work, and then that was the assignment, was like make something personal to you, um, suddenly really resonated. And so
Mm.
that's how I got to what I made at CalArts, what I'm doing now. I think that's it.
Nice. What appealed to you about experimental animation as opposed to traditional character animation? Because you've done both, and you're great at both.
Thank
So,
you. Thank you. I think right off the bat, it was just that I found it a little more natural to me.
mm,
I think I always felt like I stressed myself out a little bit when I was trying to write characters or stories that I wasn't necessarily that I just had to come up with completely. And when I started rooting things stronger in my own stories or personal stories or that of friends, it just all started to click a little bit more. So there was just the ease of it that I felt. And then I think it happened in tandem with doing creative writing in high school,
mm,
and my creative writing teacher introducing us to authors like David Sedaris and people who would do creative memoir nonfiction work. And I started writing that way right at the same time that I was really learning to animate. And
mm,
so those two things hitting at the same time was kind of perfect, because it made me realize that I didn't have to choose the medium. It was like I could choose maybe the subject more, and then I could do whatever format of art I wanted about memoir, about documentary, about personal work. And I just felt really drawn to it. So I think finding experimental was more finding myself through those things, and then realizing experimental had that within it. Um, Especially when in that high school class that was taught by experimental people, um, it helped me sort of come to the understanding of like the people coming out of this major are making documentary work. They're making, memoir, they're making creative nonfiction that maybe isn't totally real, but is based on like some sort of rooted idea of like, I love Sam Guri's work and I think that they're really creative. And I mean, their film Winners Bitch, I was like, I can't even really tell. Like I first got to see it, um, and finding the full spectrum of nonfiction work like that was really inspiring to me, and also helped me realize what I was passionate about when I was making work like that, when I make films like that, outside of motion graphics, which sometimes was a little bit separate.
yeah, that's we can talk about that later too. That's the intersection of our fields. But that's so interesting to me that your like being drawn towards experimental animation had more to do with like fiction versus nonfiction rather than like the physical elements. Because typically when I think of experimental animation, I think of like the physical media that's used rather than the content. But that's such an interesting take that I have never even considered before. Um, Maybe it's a good time to talk about your personal work and how your personal life and your personal work have connected, and to give you a little bit of congratulations, which you can talk about.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, like I was saying, it definitely felt like as soon as I was making work, I was like, let's just do what I know. And but I think there was also something to maybe needing to process through art. I think that a lot of us, and a lot of like, there's art therapy and there's things where it's very clear that art is a way of processing through really deep and intense things. And I sort of took that and was like, I just kept going with that. I was like, that's it. Yep. But it really like started from the film that I made in that high school class. I had moved really quickly and in a really kind of like upsetting way, houses, and like everything was fine with it, but it didn't feel like there was much closure through the process. And so I made this film that was like moving targets echoes moving homes, and
Mm-hmm.
sort of like processing through something in a way that Target will always look the same, but it's a different place that you're going.
Mm.
I also just really like Target, so I was like, what an excuse to just go and do that. um but I think having that first film under my belt that felt like a version of what I wanted to keep making helped me feel more confident to keep doing that. And so when I did get into CalArts and I went to the program, um, I played around with it a little bit and how I wanted to do more work like that. Like in my first year, it was doing it through interviews with other people and asking them like, it was definitely fully inspired and a little bit like a version of Creature Comforts, which is a pretty famous early Aardman short, of like doing interviews and then putting it in something that it wasn't based on, but it speaks to the same idea. So I did that with boobs, and I was like interviewing people about censorship of their bodies, which was really fun and like a great reason to get tactile. And I think speaks to your idea of like the type of work too. I think there was a little bit of like, oh yeah, you can do a lot more stop motion, you can do a lot more whatever medium you want in experimental. So I kind of took advantage of that. But okay.
I'd like to pause you because that's my favorite film. Like of like all films in existence, like that's my favorite thing
Thank
I've
you.
seen. It's anyone watching this needs to like go watch that film because it is so good and so funny and so sharp and witty. I love it.
It was really fun to do, and it was just a good opportunity to talk to people that I had made friends with in my first year at CalArts, and ideas that I'd already been thinking about because things were happening in my personal life that came back around in my thesis, of like, how do we interact with our bodies when people look at them. And I'm so sorry, I'm turn on do not disturb. I don't know. Okay, wait, can I do that?
Yeah, I mean, it's not coming through on my end. So we'll just take the moment to admire your hair and nails and
Much
a sponsored
appreciated.
break.
um okay, so that was a Slack ping, but yeah, I think that was my first time where I was like, what if I made it not as strictly documentary as I thought that the work I wanted to make was. And it was great to push myself in that way, and then sort of allow myself to come back for my next film, about photos. And again, a lot of it is like how we're perceived. Like I guess that's a lot of what I was thinking about. And I don't doubt that like me being an anxious person came into part of that, of like the whole journey of being a people pleaser, and the fact that when I tell my therapist that now, she's like, no you aren't. I'm like, but I was. And I think a lot of what I was making again was processing things, and so each year it felt like what was on my mind at that moment became the film. And so when I got to my thesis, it sort of felt inevitable, because my thesis is a short animated documentary about my dad who transitioned. And so he started that transition when he was 62, when I was in my first year at CalArts. And so when I made that film about people speaking as their breasts and things like that, he had I think he was just about to get top surgery, or he had gotten it. So it was something where I was really thinking about it. I was a little bit anxious because he was older and on medication that made it like a big surgery to get and like a kind of big deal. And um you know, he kept making these steps towards gender affirming care that he kept receiving over the course of the years that until I was making this thesis. And my work had always revolved around my personal life and things that were going on. And um, yeah, like I said, it felt really like I'm having these conversations with my dad a lot, I'm having these conversations with my family a lot, having these conversations with my friends when, you know, they're interacting or coming over, or I'm meeting new people and they're like, what's your family like? And I'm like, well, it's a little bit of a complicated backstory. Growing up with two moms and now having a single dad. And I really wanted to capture again all these things that were happening in the moment as they were happening, because even now when I look at this film, there's things that aren't accurate to it anymore. Like the film is called My Parent Neal, and I call him my dad now. So
Right.
that's a big step of something that we were talking about literally in the film and going like, we don't know if we can, how it feels. And we got there, but it's been years since the film was made that we did. And so it's both interesting and a good way to see how we've grown to look back at it. But I was really lucky in that I had really great mentors like Alexander Stewart and Pia Borg. Pia was my official mentor, and Alexander, I was a TA for him, and I was really lucky to just be able to keep bringing my work and ask for his opinion. And both of them really, I think, knowing me well helped me make this film because it was so about my life that they were already aware and seeing me grow and hearing about my dad and what, you know, my relationship with him through the course of CalArts. And I was already making work about our relationship because he's a very funny guy. And a lot of my story, like my brother and I had dinner the other day with him, and we both were like, so much of what we find most interesting about ourselves to new people is telling them about our dad. So like, I was like, yeah, of course I'm gonna make a film about this because I think he's a really cool person, but also it's this conversation that again is important to us as a family and to me and to this person who I share a birthday with and I've shared my whole life with. Ultimately, I finished it. It was wild. I started it in my junior year. I finished it like just after graduating in the pandemic. I got help from classmates, from my brother who was like at home with me and doing like rotoscoping with me. I got help from Eva, who is a fellow CalArts experimental animation student, and excuse me, my half brother Max, who did the music, and Judy, who was a film video student at CalArts and had TA to sound class that I loved. And I was really lucky to receive a grant through my major too, where I was able to, you know, get all these supplies and do all these collaborations. And I felt really proud of what I made. And there was some sadness to not being able to do a bijou screening, which is where
Yeah.
at CalArts we have the theater and we do our, you know, group thing. I'd been able to do that years past, especially being a TA too for the BFA ones and being there for theirs. And then for like the ones that I would have, it was just such a magical, fun experience. And we got to do it on Twitch, which was still super fun, but it was definitely a little bit of a like, this is what it is. And pretty much very soon after started submitting to festivals and was really honored that a lot of people wanted to screen it and have it take part. I think San Diego Underground Film Festival was the first one. I'd screened through them before. They're so lovely. They're also CalArts connected people. And from there, just sort of kept going on the festival circuit. I was contacted by the team at The New Yorker to possibly look into distributing my film and had some great conversations with them. And it eventually was published through them. So it's now online through the New Yorker documentary, which was insanely exciting and so surreal. And it's wild because I went to the San Francisco International Film Festival. I maybe had gone to another one, I can't remember, but like there's only been truly like very few times that I've seen it with a group of people. And then it came out to like everyone who reads the New Yorker and anyone who would get the New Yorker's newsletter. And it was just this kind of wild like exponential process of who was seeing my film, but in a way that felt separate from me, which was both maybe at sometimes nice because I could just let it happen without needing to feel it, but then also take in those moments when I was ready to, of like, this is a really exciting thing. And I feel really proud of this work and my dad's willingness to share with me and all of the people who helped me make something that I feel like was a good way to wrap up all I learned at school and everything I wanted to say with it.
Hmm. That's a really beautiful way to, I mean, now that you've had a little bit of distance, we were just talking about how the last time I interviewed you for something was a couple years ago and how now you have more perspective being in the industry. But I think like like you said, so much has changed and it's so interesting to like be able to look back on it. But I feel like even at the time, like when you had I was that was my first Bijou screening was like on Twitch. I like had no idea that the Bijou was like a room you could even watch things in.
Yeah.
But it felt very monumental at the time too. Like it felt like a sort of like very bittersweet capstone to your experience going through undergraduate, both like in person and then now on Zoom for like a year and a half. Do you have any sort of like perspective on it now? Like, do you feel a little detached from it because it's, infinitely, expanded its viewership? Like, does it feel strange for you to like watch something that's such a kind of beautiful snapshot of your life at a particular time and like that's I don't know. I think that's got to be kind of insane to watch your work develop like that.
It definitely was. I think a big part of it now too is I've seen it so many times, of like watching it in a film festival or even just watching it myself when I was editing it or cutting it and listening to the audio that was 5 hours long to then become 8 minutes. Yeah, that was the beginning of it.
Oh God.
But so it almost became, I think, what I would imagine a musician goes through when they've heard their songs so many times, or a designer when they've created a logo and they've looked at it and it just becomes this like thing of like it's almost a part of you, but it exists for other people to see or to take in, and you come back to it and you're like, oh, I remember that. And it still exists to me in that way, but there's also really meaningful moments of like my friend made a letterbox for it and seeing what people would say who have no connection to me whatsoever, or who have seen it in like a screening at a festival or even in like a class. It seems like some people have, which was really cool that someone was teaching and was like, this would help someone learn something. That was a really exciting moment for me. And seeing people take it in and log it and that they want to remember that they watched it
Mm.
is very meaningful to me. How I feel about it now, I think I'm processing it through how other people think about it. I don't know, because it does exist so online and like
Mhm.
ethereally. I feel like I have separated. I talk about it with people still, but there's still I think a part of me that when I meet new people, I feel like that should be the first thing that I mention. And then I have to remember that I'm like a few years out of school and I'm not working on it anymore. And I
Right.
kind of will like forget that. Because it was it was like 2 years of my college life. It was the full time of the pandemic in school. And so it just defined a lot of the work I was making, and I was around the people who I was making work about. So both of those things intertwining made me really present in the moment, and I think healthily separate but appreciative now.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Do you want to talk a little bit about your process of making it, like the roto to not roto to watercolor to 17 hours of staring at a screen kind of thing?
Yeah. I mean, I first have to say it was so great because I got so much help in deciding how it was going to look and then how I would make it look the way that I wanted it to look. And yeah, like Pia and Alexander and like me coming to them in my mid-res review and being like, I think it's going to be like paper houses and very metaphorical. And um them kind of gently going, well, you want to do that, but is that best for the film? And having to come to the realization of like, you're right. Like, I think it's something that I want to experiment with, but is it necessarily perfect for this film? And also just like what I've been making. And I've been making a lot of comics. I've been doing a lot of drawing with pencil and pen and watercolor occasionally, but I think they helped steer me in a direction that felt truer to what the work I was making outside of making films. Um, because I think when we said at the beginning that I am multiple things in that way, it's hard because I've never been like I'm a filmmaker. It's been like I make artwork and then that artwork takes several forms. And so for me, it was like, okay, this thing's gonna move, but I still want it to look like me. And that was always a little bit of a struggle at CalArts because every film I'd made looked totally different. At the end of it, I realized I was like, okay, I think I have a voice, and that to me was more important in some ways than them all looking the same. Um,
Mm.
but they helped me get that initial idea to go in the more traditional 2D look. And then it was like, well, I've done rotoscoping for a while. I really like the way it looks. And it also feels really right for capturing a personal documentary about bodies and about relationships and about change, because you're capturing something and you're always inherently going to slightly change it because you are redrawing it. And it's true to life, but slightly separate. And it felt like a really good mimic of what even like the story was in some ways. Um, and the parts that I was trying to highlight, like the texture of bodies and like the amount of like physicality that was part of this process for my dad. Um, so doing some like color tests and material tests with colored pencils and watercolor, and talking to really wonderful animators like Jamie Wolf and Dave Hess, and them giving me advice on how I could register things. Cause I was like, well, I kind of have to do this by hand, but the rotoscoping, like, how am I going to get that from my screen to me actually drawing it? And the two of them helping me just like workshop this so much to it being like, okay, I'm going to print out 4 frames to a page. I'm going to flip that page over. I'm
Oh,
going to watercolor it. I'm going to do the colored pencil on it once it's dry. Then I'm going to scan those. And on each frame, Dave gave me this great idea. He's like, put the registration bar like dots under each frame, because TV Paint will recognize those and align it for you. And so I did that, brought those in. And so it was like, I had these huge stacks of papers, but I had to remind people, I was like, each paper is actually 4 frames. So you're looking at this stack and it's like, think of it times 4
yeah.
is actually what you're seeing. As if I wasn't in the pandemic and nobody was seeing these frames for real. But you know, in my head, I was like, this is big. And Avi, my brother, helped, and I think he got to a point where he was like, I'm done. And I understood, because I was like, I committed to a big process here. But again, since it was during the pandemic, I was like filming my brother, it was filming my dad, my brother was filming me and my dad. We filmed it all in our house. So like everything that is set in a different place was filmed in my house, but I made it look in the film as if it was a waiting room, as if it was the
Got it.
sushi restaurant we've been going to together since I was 12, as if it was wherever else we went in the film. Like some elements were in our house, but some of them were different, because I wasn't going to be like, oh, we only exist in our home. We exist in every place that we go to together, and we build our relationship, and we have built our relationship. So it was an interesting process of like, okay, I want the space to feel right with the like proportions of what I've already like captured. And so there was a lot of like weird video collaging before
Yeah.
I got to the finished version. And I would print things out that were all like very like mishmash. But when I drew it, it all made sense, because I could like align it all together, if that makes sense. And then that became the version. But like Eva helped me rotoscope everything digitally first, and then when I could have printed out, I could spend more time on that digital collage. I could spend more time on the physical process, because we weren't seeing other people. So when I was watercoloring and painting, it was just by myself and with my brother. Only like there was like there's a very last scene with like the ID of my dad where he's talking and he's in the ID, that I ended up going to my friend Lily's apartment, and I was like, I desperately need to finish this. Like, please just help me do like one last. And so I kind of love it, because I can tell where she helped me. And I don't know
No.
if anyone else could, but I can see that. And it really means a lot to me, because it, if anything, is again more indicative of like, this film felt like a lot of people I care about coming together to help me make this piece that is about a person I care about and a relationship I care deeply about. So all of that felt like it meshed so well in like the process of it, the end result, and how I felt after making it.
No. Oh my God. I cried watching it, and now I'm thinking about it and I want to cry again. It's
Thank you.
like amazing that you were also able to like bring so many people together during this very physically separate time, which is insane. Like you can't
Yeah,
go to a sushi restaurant and film things. Why? Because no one can go to a sushi restaurant and film things.
yeah,
Um,
I
I
know.
could ask you questions about the film for like a year. But I think I would also like to ask you some other things about your practice. You've sort of transitioned out of being just an animator working on your own things to now working at a studio, working on other things, also personal projects. I'm wondering when you were about to graduate, we talked a little bit and you were very interested in motion graphics and how motion graphics is like adjacent to animation, but only that difference only matters to people in the industry and other people don't know the difference. And maybe you could talk a little bit about what about motion graphics you're interested in and why it appealed to you so much as someone who's interested in so many different kinds of animation.
Yeah, that's so funny that you bring that up. And I'm like, it was manifested, which I don't even really believe in, but I was like, whoa, I'm doing it now.
I
Um,
have the receipts.
yeah, exactly. Um, yeah, I again, like right before the pandemic, I started taking classes that were in the graphic design department, and I'd had a suite mate my first year who I'm still friends with today, Chandler, who was in graphic design.
Love
And
Chandler.
I think it was just one of those things where if animation was something I became aware of in middle school, it's like graphic design was something I became aware of in college. And I had that same sort of draw towards it, and then specifically towards motion graphics. And it was really exciting to have that feeling happen again, because
Mm.
I think as a creative, you maybe only expect it to happen once, where you're like, okay, I did it, like I figured it out. And it was really exciting for it to be like, it doesn't just have to be one thing, it can be whatever is exciting me at this moment. And so looking at title design, which was something that, we were doing in a class together, looking at like the way people would design logos, like people would design posters, and doing it for myself, especially when I came in without much digital experience. As a artist, I was definitely someone who worked a lot more in like physical work. Um, and so it was this sort of path into a version of animation that in some ways, I guess I always interpreted as a much more commercial route, and seeing that it could really align well with experimental in music videos, in titles, in films like Diary of a Teenage Girl, who was made by an experimental animation alum and is experimental animation, but in some ways I was like, well, there's like titles and there's accent elements. And I'm like, can we not also define this as a version of motion graphics? And again, because like you were saying, like they do overlap, right? It's not that they're entirely separate things, that they have these ebbs and flows into one another. And I also, I think, came to a realization of I really love making these films, but it's also just because of what I love making and how personal it is, it's a lot of emotional energy.
Yeah.
And so finding the balance of, okay, maybe I can do this other thing I'm really passionate about and also have the interest in this and the drive for it, but it can be translated into comics or it can be translated into short films, but it can be when I feel like I'm ready to do that again. And
Yeah.
I felt like I got to a point where I was ready to tell either other people's stories or different documentaries or interpret what a client would want. And trying those challenges was new to me and exciting, and just became another thing that I was passionate about. And so I allowed myself, I think, to follow and find that. And that's how I got to where I am
Which is
now. So I am a designer at Duke and Duck. We are a remote content studio, originally based in BC, but now we're all kind of all over the country. I even worked remote when I was in Chicago for 6 months, and we've had people go to Japan and work there, people work in Mexico and come back. Um, so it's been really wonderful because it's exactly that. Like I've worked on documentaries, I've worked on, work for nonprofits or for government organizations, for advocacy groups, and taking those same skills that I learned being a director on my own films and applying them to working with a larger team where I'm not the director. I was on a recent project, which was really exciting, but that was again a process, right? On a path there. So being able to learn from people who've been in the industry longer than me and just like be mentored and start doing art direction and letting the animation side go was a freeing and new experience that has been still really exciting to me. And I'm constantly just, I think, taking in what I can make and how I can grow. I did not know Illustrator before I started this job, and I feel very fluent in it now. I think there's definitely a lot to learn, but at least for designing like illustrative work, vector work, I'm like, I can do that. And that's not something I could have said I could have done when I started this job.
wow.
So yeah, definitely been a really wild and exciting path of being here, because I've been here. I graduated in 2021. I started like right after graduating. So it's been 2.5 years, like 2 quarter years. So a good amount of time.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy because it's like you're just starting, you have your whole life ahead of you, but you've also kind of like developed this suite of skills and talents and like multifaceted interests. I think that's like what you said about finding a second love is so exciting for me to hear because I feel like you're right that like people tend to get really sort of stuck in their ways or pigeonholed because that's kind of how either social media forces you to be in order to become famous on the internet, if that's the path you choose, or you get to be specialized in a certain field and then
Yeah.
you just do that. But that's awesome that you have this flexibility and sort of fearlessness where you're willing to take on different fields and tasks, even in things that you weren't traditionally trained in. What sort of advice do you think you would give to someone starting out in animation or design or motion graphics and like how to kind of maintain that flexibility without having a fear or a stubborn what advice would you give me? That's what I'm asking.
No, yeah. I
That's
mean,
easy.
I think also anything I'm gonna say, I'm still applying to myself. Like it's still something that I think about. But I think the biggest one for me, especially in TAing and teaching and being someone going through it myself, because I was teaching and TAing for art and animation, is like if the process feels worthwhile, like if while making it, you're learning something, you're growing, you're developing, and maybe the piece is not as good as you wanted it, it's not what you saw in your head, it was just as worthwhile because that process meant something. And so
Mm,
that was in some ways the most helpful um, way to disregard the comparison thing that always is inherent as an artist. It's just like, okay, but in the thing that I'm doing myself, that I'm wanting to do, does it feel good? Does it feel like I'm growing? Does it feel like I'm learning? And growth doesn't have to be like a straight line forward. It can be this like complete like zigzag mess of line, but there's a lot of different things in there that are still worth something when you make another project or when you come back to it. So I think finding the value in just you doing it to me is like what helps remind myself that I want to be making these things, because it doesn't have to go out for anyone to see. It doesn't even have to be something I look at again, but I made it. And that's worth something to me. And even, I've been maybe more on a break of making artwork outside of work, but I have to remind myself like that's just as valid too, of like, if I'm not feeling it, forcing it will not fix that. It's
yeah.
more like if I feel inspired to make it, if I'm really invigorated, then yeah, I'm going to make something. But I don't ever want art to become a chore or something that is so overwhelming in my life that I'm like, I have to take a break from the thing that I love. Because that's a little bit scary, I think, ultimately. And maybe I am there in some ways, but it's also like not the total farthest end of it, I guess. It's like an in between of let's look at other people's, let's get inspired. And then when I feel like it, make something.
You've still been posting a lot of sketchbook stuff. You're not sick of art. You're not
No,
there
I'm
yet.
definitely not. No. And I mean, being in a new place really helped. Like that, because I do love drawing from life. And so it was like, I'm in a place that I'm going to be in for a little while. Let's draw everything I'm seeing here. So I did love going around Chicago and just drawing what I was seeing, who I was with, the Lincoln Park Zoo, like all of these things that were just new to me. I was like, I want to capture this. It felt like a travel diary in some ways, not like all that purposefully, but more just like, I love doing this thing. It feels fun for me. And so did Lily, who I was staying with. So it was nice to go together and do it. And my brother, even too, he drew with me, which was a really lovely moment together.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, I'm thinking back to what you said earlier about like being able to make work that's very collaborative and bringing people together. And it's so interesting that you work so well both on your own, just making aesthetically pleasing things or comics or aesthetically pleasing comics, but then also have this communal aspect. Like, is there one particular way that you think you work best, or like a method you enjoy, or do you really need to switch between the two to feel sort of comfortable or balanced in your work?
Yeah. Do you mean like when I'm making work with a group of people rather than by myself?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I think, well, it's interesting because I do work at home. So it's like, I definitely struggle a bit with it because I'm a very social person. And so there's always these times of like craving being with them. And I did get to go on a work retreat, which was so wonderful, and seeing everybody. But I have learned to advocate for like, let's do a Zoom, let's do a call, let's do like a huddle on Slack. Like hearing someone else's voice and having someone else look at something helps get me out of my own head. So I think even when I'm working on something by myself, I like to loop other people in either temporarily or throughout the process. And I've been
Mm.
asking for that more at work, and I'm really lucky that they've been totally understanding. And I have coworkers who I've been able to really gel with, excuse me, and make that process happen. So that's been great work wise. Personal project wise, it is kind of nice sometimes to take a story that happened to me if it's in a comic and write it down, and I'll definitely send it to like 3 or 4 people and be like, okay, there's no comic yet, it's just writing, but what do you think, does it make sense? And a lot of times these people will have either been there for the story or be part of it, so I know that it's a bit biased, but it is helpful to be like, if you were reading a comic version of this, is it succinct enough, does it make sense, like does it feel right? And Lily is a great collaborator for that. She's read like I think all of my comics before I've made them full. um my dad too, although sometimes he's like, why are you even doing this? And that's a valid point too. um
It's not a valid point. You have great comics.
Thank you, I appreciate that. I think he's more just kind of like a cheesy guy, so I think he's just doing that. But I thought maybe he thinks I'm a little melodramatic, which is not necessarily untrue either, but again, it's the processing thing. And so when it is a comic that's deeply personal, that is kind of an individual thing sometimes, whereas when it's work for a client, it's like, let's all understand together what they want. So sometimes I'm going to assume that they want something, and that may not be true. So I want to make sure I'm always working from the right understanding, and yeah, hopefully making work that is always better because of the multiple voices that are in it. Especially if it's a story that I don't necessarily know that well or haven't gone through, or a company that I don't really know their process well. So those are always the moments where it's super helpful to work with other people. I love feedback. I love critique. I even in high school, I was in classes where we already did that. Like in figure drawing, even we would have crit sessions. And so getting CalArts continuing to have it was great. And I really am grateful that, you know, everyone gets emotional sometimes over constructive criticism, but now I feel like I've reached a point where I can be a lot more objective about it and be like, yeah, you saying that helped me make this piece infinitely better than if you hadn't have, because you wanted to be nice to me. So I appreciate it, and it helps me grow, and it helps the work grow.
Well, you're a bigger person than I am. I'm still waiting to get there. We're actually out of time.
You know,
You're incredible. I love talking to you. As you said, you're social and you're so easy to talk to. I appreciate hearing from you, and I can't wait to hang out soon.
I know, same farmers market. We're gonna go find stuff to draw from life.
Oh my God, amazing.